All righty. Well, welcome everyone to Westward 360's latest installment in our education series, Budget Development Best Practices for HOAs and Community Associations. A number of you may recognize me from prior sessions we've done, but I'm Eric Stazak, Executive Vice President at Westward 360, responsible for business development and growing our portfolio. I've been with the company for 13 years now, wearing a variety of hats, most of my time spent in leadership, heading up our association management division here at Westward 360. So very much come from an operational and in the weeds background. Today, as it lists on the invite that everyone received and on our first slide here, our focus is budget development and best practices for you all in your communities, primarily because July 1st, and that's when we're talking about a January to December fiscal year, July 1st is essentially our kickoff for budget season and when the board should really start diving in and working with their management team on budget planning. So we figured now would be a good time to go over a number of broader best practices that are applicable to all associations, whether you're local in the Chicago area like I am, whether you're in Denver, whether you're in the Tampa area, Las Vegas, anywhere that we manage. Tonight's session is primarily focused on broadly applicable budget best practices and strategies. And then do note that we will be doing continual sessions throughout this quarter and into the fourth quarter, a little bit more in the weeds about some of the specifics for your local area. So things like guides on the budget process and adoption deadlines in Colorado versus Florida versus Illinois versus Nevada. So don't feel like just because we don't dive into something very specific for your local area tonight that we aren't getting to a lot of good, valuable information, and there will continue to be more to come. But let's go ahead and get started, and I'll go over what tonight's structure is going to be. So our agenda, we want to, I'll be covering just general concepts and best practices for our first 30 minutes up until about 6:30 or so. After that, I want to transition to looking at one of our budget templates built with Westward 360's Budget Builder for this year so that all board members on the call here can have some good visibility into what the budget draft that you will be seeing in the coming weeks looks like and how it's organized. So we'll have about 15 minutes allocated for that. And then the remainder of our time, which I think will be great, is Q&A. I know a number of folks were able to submit some pre-submitted questions when they submitted their RSVP. I know a lot of you might have questions that come up as we're getting through materials. I just ask that if we can, in order to stay on agenda, if we could save and hold questions for after we get through those first two kind of modules here. If you've got any questions that you just want to remember to reference later, throw them in the chat. We will be sure to get to it and cycle through all of those as well. But we should be able to get you guys in and out in hopefully an hour, maybe just a little bit over, but I'll do our best to stay on time. But let's go ahead and get into it. So the areas that we're kind of going to go through in order this evening are just starting with the general timeline between now and year end. Strategies on looking at reviewing past performance financially, both for this year and prior years, and how that can inform this year's budget drafting. Legal requirements, just a brief note on that and the importance of it. And again, we'll have more sessions and guides for each of our states that we manage in. So boards in your local areas can make sure that you've got your kind of marching orders specific to your state's guidelines. And then finally, we will get into forecasting and reserve funding, a big topic for this evening. And then community engagement, things to ensure that you're following and going through this process with transparency, with owner involvement and visibility, obviously within reason. But we'll explore all of these key areas to make sure that you've got a strong financial foundation going into this year's planning. So one of them, going back to why we started a little bit early with July 1st rather than prior years, kind of doing this later in August. And again, for the sake of the example, we are operating with the assumption, just for tonight's session, of a January to December fiscal year. I know some of you might be on odd years with April through March, some might be on July through June, but just know that when I reference certain like dates and benchmark months, for the sake of this example, we're talking about a budget being prepared for a January through December fiscal year. So first and foremost, getting started early, generally 3 to 5 months before the fiscal year. I like closer to 5, which takes us right to mid-July, hence why we're meeting now. Couple reasons. One, June reconciliations get wrapped up right around middle of the month between the 15th and 20th. So having 6 months of budget data to kind of look at your actuals and start looking at forecasting, how performance is done year to date, it's a good time to start using that data to help build some projections on what'll be needed for the rest of the year and what'll be needed to be adjusted for 2027. But starting now is definitely best practice. We do have boards that sometimes, delay until August or September. Not the end of the world, just puts you on a little bit tighter of a time frame within to work, just given some of the state statutes, guidelines that might be in your declaration and bylaws, and other sort of dates and benchmarks that need to be looked at. The goal being to have a really meaningful draft that is essentially distribution ready by the end of August or early September. And then that way, things like meeting notices for eventual budget adoption can go out on time. Those can get scheduled for prior to holiday season when schedules get incredibly busy and people want to focus on personal lives rather than their business or their volunteer positions as board members. So goals are to help complete the adoption process and getting budgets out to communities, ideally 30 plus days before the new year. Obviously, there's some wiggle room there, but that generally puts us on a nice timeline to be able to just get this done without having to rush through certain processes. So we've found in our experience, making July really meaningful, making August really meaningful, definitely saves work and time for that September, October, November 90-day cycle where things start to get a lot busier, more chaotic, and harder to manage. And a quick note and reminder, just because boards still get tripped up on this sometimes. Board workshops, if you are meeting as a quorum of the board to start reviewing and meeting about your budget, when in doubt, just trust that you might need to notice that meeting. You don't want to have what could be constituted as an illegal meeting or an improperly noticed meeting because you're discussing board business without it being properly notified. So make sure you're always aware of those meetings where the board is getting together, whether just as the board, whether you're with management. There really shouldn't be these like off the books meetings where a majority of the board and management are getting together to discuss association business like the budget. Generally speaking, a lot of those things should be happening within the confines of a meeting. So maybe lean on your treasurer, maybe lean on your finance committee, maybe focus on having just 2 board members meeting with your manager to help consolidate efforts a bit. But just be a little bit vigilant on that. If you've been a little bit loosey-goosey in years past, make sure when in doubt, ask your manager. Let's make sure that we aren't putting you in a position where you're having meetings that are off the books and potentially illegal. Big one, and this is probably the most obvious, reviewing past financial performance. This is something that's done through a variety of means. Many of you who've been longer term customers know that in our budget builder and our templates that we produce, not only do we put current year actuals, but we also put last year actuals so that you have something to benchmark against. In an ideal scenario, if we've been managing you for longer than that, we're looking at even prior year's data, 2024, 3, 2, just because there could be things that do help inform cost allocations, trends on inflation, trends on cost spend and utilization in certain GL line items, which is a general ledger item. So looking at multiple years of data is really great. That helps you be proactive on utility cost fluctuations and updated rates on your recurring maintenance agreements, on any new agreements that you might be getting into. Starting now allows us to start getting updated pricing as well. So, starting the budget process in September, October, as you can imagine, that puts the manager and vendors in a pinch of trying to get updated pricing. If we're going to vendors now and asking for those things, it's a lot easier for them to accommodate that when things aren't as busy and chaotic as we get towards the end of the year. But looking at things like utility cost fluctuations, as I mentioned, increased rates in service and maintenance agreements, maintenance and repair expenses. And I do want to make sure that people know the difference between those, where maintenance tends to be your pre-planned actual, events that help extend and maintain the longevity of your common elements, whereas repairs are the reactive things often that happen as a result from lack of maintenance or just emergency act of God kind of scenarios. But we do often have boards sometimes that kind of lump maintenance and repairs into generalized categories. Those are separate things. So make sure when you're looking at past spend, you're actually looking at maintenance spend and repair spend specifically, because your, roof maintenance spend might be very, it might be a larger number, but presumably that means your roof repair line item will comparatively be a lower number. So those are distinct categories. It'll probably make a little bit more sense as we look at the draft budget example as well. And then a huge one that we'll be covering on a later slide, reserve fund contributions. As many people should know by now, but if you don't, there are new guidelines that have gone into effect and will be going into effect for January of 2027, increasing the reserve contribution that many communities will need to be making up from 10% to 15%. So that'll be an important one to keep in mind this year. Another category that's also really good to take a look at just for cash flow purposes is your delinquency rates, right? So if you're in a larger community, 100, 200, 300 units or homes, having a few units with high delinquency balances, maybe not as big of a budget breaker for you. If you're in a small community though, and if you only have 16 or 20 units and 4 or 5 homeowners are delinquent on their assessments, that might be creating cash flow problems for you, which might create problems in terms of budgeting for 2027. Will you have the funds to afford the maintenance and repairs that you're budgeting for? So now is the time, if you haven't looked at your AR report in a while or haven't gotten with your manager to discuss outstanding balances, now is a perfect time to start looking at those, start taking action on whether folks have to go to collections or just need follow-up, and make sure that some of those get tied up and acted upon now rather than running into problems as we start rolling out the budget and acting on it in January of next year. But ultimately, it'll help get an understanding of where past budgets have gone over or under estimated expenses, help refine your projections, and really just prevents repeating previous mistakes that, your board or maybe a prior board at your community may have made. Little tip that we want to make sure that we also note, just because sometimes board treasurers or especially new board members don't always know to look for some of this kind of spend from prior years. But don't forget to factor in recurring maintenance that doesn't just happen every single year. Sometimes a board might see that, hey, last year we didn't spend anything on street maintenance and repaving and remilling the roads. Now, that might be because you guys are on an every 2 or 3 or 4 year cycle. Maybe you have common area wooden decks that need to get power washed and treated and stained every 3 to 5 years. Those things are non-recurring on an annual basis, but they are recurring on, a 2, 3, 4, 5 year cycle. So one thing that we do want to just offer as a tip, don't forget to factor those things in. Go back to budgets from 2024, 2023, 2022. Make sure that if any of those kind of rarer cyclical repairs haven't yet been allocated, that if it's time to allocate for those, we'll do that. Don't worry, your managers are also trained to be looking at these things as well and being proactive about capturing these things in your initial budget drafts. But for you as board members, also important to be looking at these things as well. A quick note on legal requirements, and I'm going to sort of fly through these next few slides just to give you a few examples. But for customers in Illinois, things like Illinois Condominium Property Act and Common Interest Community Association Act should be fairly familiar to you. You don't have to know every last little bit of legalese around them or what every last nook and cranny means. But the reason that I highlight this, and I highlight a few other states here in a second too, is just that each of these in states where there's a high level of regulation for homeowners associations and community associations to operate, there are often a number of benchmarks and important dates and ramifications that are put in those documents that dictate notice periods, dictate number of owners that it might take to petition, a budget that they want to reject potentially. So there are a number of different statutes state by state that are very important. We will be putting together guides for each state that we operate in so that we can send these out to boards just with a brief summary of the key points for each of these. So things like familiarity and how the Illinois Condo Act and Common Interest Community Association Act impact budget timing for Illinois customers. Things like CCIOA, which is the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, how that impacts the budget adoption process and timing. For those in Nevada, everyone is very familiar with NRS and a number of the statutory guidelines and requirements in NRS, which is a very high-level kind of complicated document. And then Florida as well. Florida not only has legislation around HOA, they have distinct legislation around condos. There are differences in how each of those operate. So the reason I want to share these things is that depending on where you are, there are also other factors you need to be planning for. So lean on us for guidance around the timing for your budget process. A lot of the reason, again, that we like to start early is that, especially in states with high levels of regulation, particularly Florida and Nevada, that we are doing it on time. We don't want to put the board in a position of, being off cycle, missing certain deadlines, not serving notice and the proper cadence, not adopting at the proper cadence. Nevada, I know, has a really lengthy package of documentation that has to be sent out when that budget is approved and proposed. So there's a lot of those things that the guides that we're producing that'll be ready for boards later in August will be helpful on. But when in doubt, lean on your management team and they can guide you through some of those benchmarks as well. But I do want to make sure that folks are staying in tune with their local state guidelines and requirements around some of these benchmark dates. And if there are any specific questions that folks have on that, we can dive into those when we get to Q&A in just a little bit. Forecasting of revenue. I think this is something that is often under emphasized, I think, for a lot of associations with fairly uncomplex and fairly simple budgets. You might often only have your regular assessment as your primary income line item. But for many of you out there, there are going to be a variety of income line items. That could be things like your regular assessments, of course, whether they're annual, quarterly, monthly, or at a different cadence. You might have special assessments for distinct projects, long-term reserve replenishment, or other discretionary purposes for that special that also might be an income stream. So being able to forecast that, especially since many special assessments can be multi-month, multi-year, you want to make sure that you are spending time getting that number very accurate, not making assumptions for collection that you won't receive, and making sure that you're accurately forecasting that. Particularly if you're a community that tends to run a pretty high delinquency rate for a variety of reasons. Don't be hedging your bets if you know you have a chronic problem on that you're going to collect 100% of your income every single month. If you are aware of some issues that you have on cash flow and with accounts receivable, let's plan those contingencies within your budget. Things like late fees in terms of forecasting revenue. Our mindset at Westward 360 is that late fees really only should have a corresponding budget number if it's historically significant. If you're a large community that tends to have a lot of folks that just run into, late payments, and it is an identifiable true income line item, greater than a few $1,000s, maybe that is worth budgeting. Our mindset often is that we don't like the idea of budgeting for income that is not necessarily guaranteed and doesn't have a lot of good data that supports the number that backs it up. So I think, to keep it simple, if you are a community where on average you've collected $1,000 a year in late fees every single year for the last 5 years, probably a safe bet that you could budget $1,000 for late fees. If you have a big old line graph chart that it wavers considerably every single year, probably best to budget 0 for late fees. Don't hedge your bets on additional income that might not come. And if you do realize some, great. But if not the end of the world. Late fees, fines, those shouldn't be really thought of as income line items. Those are things that should hopefully be deterrents, that you're not relying on that income stream as part of your budget planning. But it could be something that you might want to accommodate if significant. Rental income, not always going to be something that applies to you at your community, but examples could include if you lease out any parking spaces, if you lease out common amenity spaces, maybe a clubhouse, maybe a party room, maybe the association has possession of or owns units within the community and you lease those out to tenants. That rental income should definitely be captured. So if you are a little bit more complex of a community or you have ulterior income streams via rentals of amenities, association-owned units, parking or storage, those are things that we want to make sure that we accurately include and forecast for year-end numbers to inform 2027. Common element fees, sort of a similar setup, but this could include things like amenity charges. So maybe you have, monthly reservation fees for use of a gym in your community that is optional. Maybe that could be for a parking fee. Maybe it's a fob sticker. Maybe it's your RFIDs that have to get distributed by an admin in your clubhouse or from our office at the front desk. Whatever the case is, if those are significant numbers that do come in and need to be allocated for, let's make sure that those are included in your draft. And then finally, investment interest. I know that interest rates, as they've come down a little bit from some of the peak highs that they were at middle of last year, before things dropped off a little bit, there'd be some really significant interest accumulation, especially for associations with some pretty sizable reserves accounts. So I know for some communities, when you're a little bit smaller budget, you don't have many units, you don't have many income streams, your interest in a money market account, even at 3.5% or 4%, might be a little bit negligible, but it could be really meaningful. That could be hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of dollars for some of our communities, depending on what your interest income might be. So don't just assume that interest is a negligible number. That could be very important to capture. So we'll show you where we kind of log interest numbers and things of that nature in our budget drafts. Obviously, accurately forecasting expenses. We've broken this thing into a few different categories just to kind of change things up a little bit to give you a little bit of a different way of looking at some of these things. But some things that we more or less will consider a bit more fixed, where the bills that come in throughout your calendar and fiscal year are largely going to be fairly predetermined by existing agreements or renewals that have been signed or recently just auto-renewed. But things like your insurance premium, maybe you just had a renewal and you got your numbers for your July through June policy period, and you know what that cadence of billing is going to look like. Those should be fairly easy for us to accurately forecast. So your insurance premiums, likely a good example of that. And we want to make sure that we're looking at not only your property insurance, but your liability policy, your D&O, your fidelity, workers' comp, anything under the sun that your association has insured. We want to make sure those are all allocated. Your service contracts, those are things that generally have fixed amounts to them. So that might be something like your landscaping maintenance. Maybe that's $1,000 a month for months April through November if you're in the Midwest. So where we have predictable expenses, we want to make sure we capture those, allocate them to the correct months, and really focus on getting those numbers really dialed in, because it should be fairly simple for us to do that. Management fees, great example of that. A lot of your renewals with our agreements are on January cycles. Some of you might be in mid-year, June, July, August, September, depending on when you onboarded. We will be able to help extrapolate that data for you. So if it's, 3 months at the current rate and then the next 9 months at, a 3% escalator, depending on what was in your management contract, we will factor in that nuance so that that is all accurately allocated. And then things like loan payments. If your association is currently paying off a loan, that loan payment should be predictable month over month. So those things really we should be able to set up pretty simply. Your variable expenses are going to be those things that are going to be really well informed by prior year's data. So your utilities, depending on what rate increases maybe have been shared by your local utility providers. In some cases, that could be predetermined rates. I know often municipalities will share planned increases for water delivery and sewerage, for instance. Whereas, ComEd in Illinois might send, rate increases middle of the year. So sometimes some of these can be hard to budget for, but utilities, we should be able to use at least prior years and current years data and trends to be able to get some good projections for this and next year. Repairs and maintenance, self-explanatory, but again, repairs and maintenance, those are two different things. Maintenance in theory should be a little bit less variable because that's often going to be based on service contracts and very express specific scopes of work for annual or quarterly maintenance for certain elements that you maintain in the association versus your repairs, which are largely going to be very reactive. So, bucket totals for how much you spent on just general plumbing repairs over the last 2 to 5 years are going to be helpful to inform what a good number is. Same with roof repairs, same with mechanical repairs, things of that nature. But maintenance categories, again, generally a bit more fixed, predictable, simpler to budget for because those actually happen usually on a fairly predictable cadence. Landscaping and snow removal, as a lot of you know, some of that is very predictable. Some of it might not be. If you are in a location where you get a lot of snow, or it can be really just up to that year's weather trends, snow removal can be a very hard to pin down target. But there should be some of those that are fixed costs. If you are on a seasonal contract, for those that are on per push contracts, that's often going to be harder to predict, but that's where some seasonal numbers from prior years is going to be helpful. And then legal and accounting services. The predictable side of legal and accounting might be things like if you have a retainer agreement with your attorney, or if you have an annual audit or compilation that you budget for on the accounting side. Those are very predictable. If you don't do those things, though, your accounting fees and legal fees, a lot less predictable. You're at the mercy of hourly rates from that provider, not necessarily having a fixed contract in place. So just be vigilant on that. Be reasonable about what you're budgeting, but more importantly, be realistic. If you know that you're a board that tends to utilize your attorney's legal advice, maybe get a quote for a retainer if you haven't gotten one anytime recently. If you use it more sparingly and you only reach out to legal once or twice a year, maybe just doing it on a reactive basis is fine for your community, but do take a look at that. It's really important to help decide which direction is best for you. And then finally, capital expenses, a really big one. Consult your reserve study, which we'll be getting to in a moment. Allocate your reserve contributions. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. That 10% number that was really conventional for a number of years for Fannie and Freddie guidelines is now moving to 15%, with the exception of a few express cases, which we'll get into shortly. So reserve contributions are going to be something that impacts your budget pretty significantly this year if you are a community that historically has had trouble budgeting the minimum recommendation of 10% in years past. Obviously, things like major repairs, replacements, or if you're considering improvements, all of those factor as capital expenses, generally things that should be in the reserve portion of your budget, not necessarily operating expenses, which is another distinction we'll kind of get into when I pull up the budget draft in a moment. And then finally, contingencies. One of the things that not every board does, but something that we recommend if you do have the bandwidth within your budget, is doing some contingency budgeting. Maybe that's an overall contingency that totals about 5% of your total expenses. Maybe that's an extra, 2 to 5% on plumbing or general repairs, but have some level of contingency in the event some of your budget categories go over. Maybe it ends up being a harsh year on your plumbing risers because you're in a high rise that hasn't yet budgeted for a riser replacement project, and you start going over. If that's been a routine in years past, consider making a contingency so that you do have some overflow in another budget line item that might be helpful in terms of allocating some additional funds if you do have a rough year in a certain repair category. Also helps protect with some inflation buffer, also helps with emergencies that might come up throughout the year. And then final tip of just use those vendor quotes and inflation estimates that often your manager is collecting to help ensure accuracy, throughout the budget process. Like while you're looking at your draft, we might get notified of an increase or a rate change or something like that. We can dynamically factor that in. If we get notified in September about a rate change that's going into effect, we can always apply that to the budget. It's not completely set in stone until it's obviously adopted. So we can always factor things in as certain quotes or rate increases or adjustments get informed to the management team or to the board. Reserve funding and 2027 updates. And there will be more sessions about this particular topic because I know that it's a sensitive one. But the biggest takeaway is that unless you have a current reserve study, especially one where you have been following the full funding plan that your reserve study recommends, unless you are doing that, your minimum contribution as an association will need to be 15% of your operating budget is allocated to go to your reserves. In years prior, the benchmark from Fannie and Freddie lending guidelines was always 10%. Now, because of most of this is rooted in the really terrible Surfside collapse that happened in Florida about 3 to 4 years ago, where a beachside high-rise actually collapsed due to a number of things, but most importantly, deferred maintenance, structural issues not being promptly addressed, and not using the guidance of professionals that were making recommendations to that community for a number of years. So hence, that has made regulation around things like reserves expenses, deferred maintenance, capital expenses to keep up with common elements that degrade over time. There is a huge priority put on this. What this ultimately means, just from a Fannie Freddie perspective, is that the 15% guideline, now, just to make an important distinction, this isn't the court of law that is saying that your budget has to hit 15% for your reserves allocation. That being said, if you're not hitting that 15% allocation, unless you're fully funding based on your reserve study, you are going to run into a scenario where people that are getting conventional mortgages and lending to purchase their units or their homes within your community will not be able to be approved for conventional financing without a budget that indicates that 15% allocation. So while some boards might say, hey, it's not my problem that, that person, can't get their conventional loan, we are only going to budget 12%. I think that can be a very short-sighted position and opinion. You really need to make sure that people have the ability to come into your community, that they have the ability to sell their units in your community, and you're going to have a constituency and ownership group that will be very frustrated quickly if they're running into issues with being able to get a mortgage or refinance, if they're running into problems because your budget was not adopted with those things in mind. So we cannot emphasize enough. 15% is the number that you really should be operating unless you are absolutely certain that your community has an up-to-date and current reserve study and that you are fully funding based on that reserve study, which many associations are not. So best frame of reference is go in expecting that you are going to need to be budgeting 15% into reserves for 2027. One good thing to note is that our budget builder template already factors that in. So as we're making adjustments, as we're looking at whether assessments will need to be increased or we need to use a sharper pencil on any expense line items in your budget, remember that we are factoring in that 15% allocation. So we will be operating with that in mind. That'll help the budget process and make sure that you're understanding that all of these adjustments that we might entertain or consider all are going to be based with that 15% number in mind. One thing to note too, and I imagine there might be questions about this too, we will be doing another webinar on the 21st hosted by Reserve Advisors, who is a partner that produces reserve studies that we have worked with before, but they will also be covering some additional specifics around this. But briefly, if you do not have a reserve study, it is a really useful document that helps you allocate and plan for the financial impact that you should be budgeting for the next, 20 to 30 years. It evaluates your common elements, evaluates the current maintenance conditions, the maintenance history and replacement history that you've done, and starts allocating the useful life expectancy of those elements and when you are going to next have to meaningfully repair, replace, or maintain them, and then builds a financial plan around that. So reserve studies can be really helpful. In some states that we operate in, they're a mandate already. So states like Nevada, states like Florida, there's a lot of things in place where you're already doing these because you have to in your state. States like Illinois, states like Colorado, other states that aren't as highly regulated, like the 8 or 9 in the United States that have a lot more legislation around community associations, they don't necessarily have reserve study mandates, but it is a trend. It is happening in more states, more and more since the Surfside collapse. It is not out of the question that in states throughout the Midwest and out west especially, that reserve studies will soon become a mandate in future years. So if you have not started thinking about them, budgeting for them, or considering them, now is the time to start that process. We have a couple of partners that can easily provide good quotes and some benchmark numbers for you for 2027. So lean on your management team for additional info about that. But hopefully this is helpful in terms of giving you some extra emphasis on the importance of that 15% contribution that needs to be kept in mind for 2027. Again, a little bit self-explanatory, but account for delinquencies. It's not uncommon that a 10% or less rate of delinquency might be the status quo in your community. That's not terrible. You at least want to be under 15% for lending guidelines and things of that nature. Most of our communities are under 5%, which is really great, but hovering, at a 10% or less delinquency rate is not uncommon, but do revisit that, just because if you see, this blue pie, the light blue color, starting to take up more and more of this pie, that could really be creating cash flow problems for you. And aside from that, look at inflation considerations. I know last year when we were doing a similar presentation, we were in the throes of which tariff was next and which country was next and which supply chain was affected next. I know some of that has settled down, but there still are day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month things that are happening around the world that could potentially impact certain things, whether it is material prices, premiums for insurance, labor costs, things of that nature. Your manager, first and foremost, is the one handling, looking at those things and getting you more refined numbers, but something that you as treasurer or just as a general board member should be looking at as well. One of the final notes too is, and I think that this sometimes doesn't get emphasized enough, but engage owners and maintain transparency. Like I said, when you have those quorum of a board meeting and you're having that budget workshop and it should be a noticed meeting, make sure you get that notice out. It doesn't mean the owners have to attend or have the right to speak at that meeting, but operating above board with transparency to kind of show how the sausage gets made, so to speak, is sometimes, it just helps with clarity, helps in delivering hard messages sometimes when the budget is, a rude awakening for some folks. Maybe it's a hard year with assessment increases, or high cost increases due to, insurance claims or issues that your community ran into. If owners have more visibility into the process, we've found that they have fewer questions. There's less of this feeling of, oh, I was blindsided by a really aggressive increase. If they've been attending some of your open meetings where you're talking about some of those things, even though they might not like the result, they've at least seen the rhyme or reason that went into those decisions and maybe have a little bit more trust and respect for the job that the board did to present that budget, rather than just feeling like you're trying to gouge them on another assessment increase or a special assessment or things of that nature. So opening those up and making sure that meetings are properly visible where they should be, providing summaries and up-to-date minutes about those things so that people know about some of those key things that are impactful as your minutes get adopted and approved, and then making sure that you're distributing your proposed budget via multiple means. Your state statute might say that you have to just mail this out, but make sure, your manager will make sure it's uploaded on the portal. Make sure it's emailed out. Make sure that no one has an excuse to share with the board or management, I didn't get that, or I never received a copy of that budget, or this is the first time I'm seeing this. We don't want that to be a reality. So not only hitting your statutory guidelines, but creating redundancy, making sure that that budget is visible, sending reminders of that budget meeting multiple times so that no one is feeling like they were left out of the process or blindsided by bad news or even good news. One of the final things too, when necessary, consult with financial and legal experts. If you're a community that newly came on board with Westward 360 and you left a management scenario where someone was not taking care of your finances well, there were, concerns around malfeasance from prior management or self-management, whatever the case is, it might be best that you start considering an audit. So let's loop in that CPA or that accounting firm that can help with that. If you are considering getting a reserve study update, or you already have one in progress, work with your reserve specialist to make sure you understand that reserve study and know how to apply it to your budget so that it's allocated and properly recorded in your 2027 draft. And then your attorney, of course. If you already work with one, great. If you need a reference for one, your manager can always provide one. But if any questions come up about any sort of proposed line items, sensitivity around increases, notice requirements, sensitive statute questions, your attorney is going to be the best resource on that. We know a whole lot on our end, but we're not lawyers. So when there's some of those hairy questions that sometimes need a little bit more guidance, even if it costs a little bit of money to get it, sometimes that can be well worth avoiding the pain that not going to that expert could create down the road. One final note too is maintain a comprehensive audit trail. If you had budget document assumptions made via drafts and other different projections and things that factored into your estimates, save those. If you had bids that inform those decisions, let's save those in the 2027 budget planning folder that we keep in Google Drive and in Vantaca. If you have meeting minutes related to those budget decisions, keep those consolidated and organized. And all of those owner communications, if anyone tries to say that, hey, you know what, I don't think the notice went out on time, I don't think this followed due process and procedure, I didn't receive X, Y, or Z, save those. So I know that we as manager are often the ones sending those things out and organizing all of that. Sometimes we do have a very involved treasurer or finance committee or other people that are really helpful in making that budget plan happen. So if you are a collaborator in that budget process, make sure that you're saving that documentation so that it's easily accessible if any questions come up down the road, or if you just want to see, you know, in the past, what helped inform some of your budget decision making. And then adjust your forecast throughout the year. After you get through the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, look at how that's performing and what you realistically think that how that'll change and impact future years of budgeting. So this is really another just reminder to look at your monthly financials. Make sure that as treasurer, you know, obviously we're preparing them, we're looking at them, but it's important that the board remain informed about those. So that helps you ensure that you're tracking income and expenses, that they're staying on budget. You're identifying trends that are going against that early so you can actually make meaningful decisions to help combat that, rather than, you know, looking at it for the first time in September or October and wishing you had taken a closer look at your financials a quarter earlier. So make sure that you are taking that deep dive, looking through the monthly financials and summaries that we're providing to you, because they can help not only right now through future 2027 budget planning, but in years ahead as well. State-specific consideration, again, that's going to pertain to things like reserve requirements, disclosure rules around the budget process, notice requirements, and meeting notices. Again, we will have guides supplied to all boards that have specifics for your state, but we just want to make sure that these general categories are kept top of mind. And then finally, in conclusion, the idea here is with all of this work and all of this emphasis, you can build a strong financial foundation. The biggest things are starting early, right around now, with a detailed plan, prioritizing that reserve funding, making sure that that's factored in, because that is going to impact all of your other budget decision making is huge this year, and maintaining that transparency will also help with the buy-in and adoption of your budget. Regardless of whether it's legally enforceable, we've found it's often helpful. It's the more and more buy-in you have amongst your homeowner constituents helps the budget season go that much better. And next steps before we get into reviewing the draft of the budget that we have to look at for 2027, a few things to note for boards. So 2027 fee schedules for anything outside of your management fee. These are being shared with the management staff this Thursday at our regular weekly staff meeting. Boards, you should see those as soon as next week. So we will begin distributing 2027 fee schedules to you all. So if you have been asking for one, those are coming very shortly. June reconciliations, those are scheduled to be completed between the 15th and 20th of July for most communities, some a little bit earlier, but most should be completed there. So July or June financials will be available in about a week to 10 days for most communities. And then that will be a nice benchmark point for you to start working with your initial draft supplied by your manager. As a board member, you should expect that your initial draft for workshopping purposes will be out to you between July 15th and August 15th, depending on the dates that you have started working with your manager in terms of your budget schedule for this year. And we do have a number that have already gone out to some boards. So some of you on the call may have already received an initial draft from your manager. Others, you might be receiving it in the coming days as well. And then we do plan to send out budget adoption guides out to boards right before September 1st so that ahead of the final 4 months of the year, you have good guidance on benchmark dates that you should be paying attention to and keeping in mind as you work through the rest of the process. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a reserve study guidance and lending implications webinar happening July 21st, 6 p.m. Central. Invites have started to go out for that. So if you have not gotten that yet, likely you'll be receiving that tomorrow and Thursday. So stay tuned for that. We will now move over, before we get to Q&A, into a broad overview of a sample draft budget, just to get everyone initiated into how we arrange ours, and then a couple of small adjustments that were made for 2027 planning. So on my screen, everyone should be seeing a draft budget that lists the Residences of Thatcher Woods Condominium Association 2027 draft budget operating. So this is a community that we do actually manage here in the suburbs of Illinois, that we've used as an example just because their initial draft was populated by their manager just the other day. There hasn't been a ton of adjustments yet made on it just because they just input this a couple of days ago. But a few things to point out. Your budget and the version that your manager will be working with has a few different tabs on it. You can largely ignore this configurations one. It's just got a few settings that we input into our budgeting system. The ones that will be most impactful and most frequently visited for you as a board member are going to be your operating budget tab, your draft budget reserve tab, where we are going to log any reserve or capital income and expense, your assessment tab, which will help calculate what any sort of proposed increases might look like in terms of impact to your monthly assessment. And then 5-year plan, which is a tab that we started utilizing a couple of years ago, but helps us take a number of expense items from your reserve study and start plotting them into the next 5 years. So if we know some of these things are happening, if we know that a special assessment has been passed to save up for a 2029 roof replacement, we can start allocating those things that might impact future years' budgets as well. And then finally, we have a chart of accounts, which lists the kind of the glossary by GL code, general ledger code, and the income description and the expense GL code and the expense description. So if you're ever looking for like where that GL code is or which one that was, you always have this as a little guide, but on your actual draft budget, it will state both the GL code and the description of what that is meant to represent. So for this sample budget, on the top lines here, you're going to see essentially your top line revenue. For Residences of Thatcher Woods, that's going to include their unit assessment income. They're on monthly assessments. They have parking unit assessment income because their parking spaces have percentages ownership associated with them. They also have parking rental because they do have spaces that are rented out. So this is kind of what I was getting at, where you might have assessment income, you might have rental income. These things could be distinct, but we make sure that we have all of these properly allocated into express and specific GL codes so that we're not commingling income or expenses into just confusing categories that are a huge pain to try to unravel years down the road. Special assessments. In this case, this is an example of a community that has a couple of different ones listed here. So they had a special assessment back in 2025, hence this last year actuals. So they use, this is helpful in informing like, hey, now we have data here that shows we had a special assessment last year. We also have a special assessment this year. Now that's kind of giving the board important trend information of, hey, you know what? If we're considering a special assessment, will that be, is that the right choice? Will that be politically hard because it's the third year in a row where we're passing a special assessment? In any case, if you have multiple specials going on at once, if you're considering one, if one is wrapping up and you have a new one starting, we will separately allocate those special assessments, both on the income side and then anywhere on the expense side where it might correspond. Some communities, and again, this is going to be very different depending on how complex or complicated your community is, you might have a number of other income line items. So maybe that's, fine and violation income that is pretty significant. So in years past, Thatcher Woods has budgeted $8,000. Last year, they collected almost $31,000 in fine and violation income. So for this particular community, budgeting for fines and violations is actually probably pretty smart because that's a significant dollar figure. Whereas if you rarely have fines or violations that are assessed, probably not something that you necessarily need to budget for. Late fees, again, for them, a little bit more significant than some communities. So they've generally made the decision to budget for those. Other fees could be things like lease registration income, miscellaneous income from, generally speaking, we like to avoid these miscellaneous categories. Usually these things can find a more specific bucket, but maybe you're a board that sees value in that. We can work with you on that. But generally speaking, it might be best to just zero this out unless there's a very specific reason as to why that's in there. If you have move-in, move-out fees, another great category to ensure you're budgeting for. Pet fee income, maybe you have a pet fee in your rules and regulations. You have the ability to budget for that too. And then finally, some of these are some of the other more pass-through kind of things. So like legal collections reimbursement, these would be paying back legal expenses that the associations incurred for collections activity. So it's sort of an income line item, but generally speaking, it's offset by the actual legal collections expense. So some of these things might have some corresponding expenses that offset the income, which is why we have these sort of separated out into their own little sort of block of income other here. So then each of our budgets is set up to help highlight your total operating income so that you know what that bottom line figure is. Under income, as you might expect, that's where we start getting into expenses. So we generally categorize these into broader buckets. So any administrative expenses get under our 6,000 GL codes here under expense administrative. So that could be things like bonuses if you have janitors or staff that you give bonuses to. Maybe that's bank fees if you have any sort of fee with a reserves account that you hold with another bank. Maybe that is bad debt or uncollectible income that you're writing off. Maybe that's lease admin fees, but anything administrative is in its own sort of subsection with a bottom line number as well. Residences of Thatcher Woods, they have a number of community expenses related to their amenities because they have a clubhouse, they have a number of maintenance categories, utilities, and other things. So this might be a completely not relevant subsection for your community. It won't exist if you do not have amenity expenses. It'll only exist if you're a community that does budget for these sort of amenity items, whether that's your pool, clubhouse, party room that's reserved, amenity room of any kind. All of those would fall into this general bucket. We have compliance, another section for things like your elevator testing, fire alarm repairs and expenses, plumbing and diagnostics of inspections if you have like a routine cadence on that. Some municipalities do have periodic plumbing inspections that have to be done. Some have boiler inspections that have to be done. It is different depending on where you are, but your manager can help guide you on what is the appropriate budget to categorize there. Very similarly, fire, life safety, we put it under compliance just because those are closely related. Things like your fire alarm testing, fire pump testing, repairs that fall in those categories, dry and wet sprinkler systems. Again, those could be things that are relevant to your community. Generally, if you're like in a condominium or townhome community, those of you in single family home associations, you're largely not going to see a lot of these things like fire alarm and fire. You might have a fire pump depending on some of the layout of your community. Maybe you do have things like a clubhouse that has, a plumbing element that has to be inspected, but a lot of these are going to be a little bit more condo related. Insurance, fairly self-explanatory, but the one thing to just remember is that we like separating these out just based on the kinds of coverages you have. Rather than just bundle everything into one insurance line item, let's specify because there could be separate rates for your fidelity, liability, umbrella, workers' comp. Commercial package sometimes includes fidelity, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it includes your director's office and officer's insurance. Sometimes it doesn't. So depending on how your insurance is packaged or bundled, we want to make sure that we're not just assuming that it's bundled. If there are express policies with their own express invoices, we want to make sure that we're setting up distinct GL categories for those. Landscaping service, snow removal service, fairly self-explanatory. Routine maintenance line items, pest control, janitorial, elevator maintenance. Again, these are largely going to be a number of your more fixed costs. Your planned maintenance, things that you generally budget for ahead of time. You have a preferred vendor that performs that work. Those things are on a set cadence. Generally speaking, this maintenance section should be a lot of those fixed costs, and then you're allocating for any planned like increases in that service contract, any baked in increases that are in auto renewal, things of that nature. And then under that is where you're going to get into a couple of other categories. Things like professional fees. So things like community management, our management fee falls into that professional fee. If you work with an architect or engineer to help give guidance on a capital project, that might be situated there. Legal, accounting, maybe you work with a CPA. I know there's a CPA firm, Canty and Associates, I believe, that Residences of Thatcher Woods works with on an annual basis for their audit. So they always budget for this. Your association might not budget for an audit annually, but could be something relevant to you all. And then getting into repairs, this is going to be where things are more reactive, right? You've got data from prior years that kind of give you some guidance on spending trends and issues that have come up in the past. Things that could inform that are those exact trends I just mentioned, but also take a look at what capital work that you've done recently. If you have a boiler and radiant heat system in your community and you just replaced that and it's brand new, I would generally expect that your repair allocation is probably going to be much lower than it was this year when you didn't have that system in. So revisiting your repair categories after some of these projects have been completed is also a good kind of tip to kind of approach your repair categories with. But largely, again, this is where you want to allocate for more of those reactive things that might come up as needed beyond just the planned maintenance items that you allocate for. Depending, again, on the community and the level of sophistication, complexity, things of that nature, you might only have 3 or 4 repair line items. You might have, the 24 that Residences of Thatcher Woods has here because they are a slightly larger community, more complex, multiple amenities, a lot of different moving parts. So hence a little bit more complicated of a budget with a lot more line items. And then finally, you get into your supplies, your transfers to reserves, which is going to be what allocates the level of reserve contribution that's going into the reserves account in that monthly transfer throughout the year. If you have any special assessments, if you have any loan assessment transfers happening to move that income over to a reserves account, you can log those things here. And then last but not least, utilities. So that could include things like your bulk agreements, if you have one for cable and internet, association cable. Obviously things that keep the lights on like electricity and gas, telephone, trash removal, water and sewer. Sometimes depending on your municipality, they separately bill those things. So depending on how that works with your community, we'll make sure that's either consolidated or split out. And then ultimately, you get your bottom line operating expense and your overall net operating income, which is going to show your total balance, your income minus your planned expenses. So that kind of runs you through kind of top to bottom in terms of the operating side of the budget. Taking a quick look, and I'll keep this accessible, so if we need to go back to it during the Q&A part, we absolutely can, so don't worry about that. Taking a quick look at the reserve side of things, this is where we're able to log things like reserve interest income, reserve transfer income, so logging what is coming from the operating account into the reserves account. So just to make sure no one's confused on that, on the operating side of the budget, your transfer to reserves is ultimately an expense. That money is coming out of your operating account, so we budget it as an expense. On the reserves portion of the budget, that's an income category because that's the account that's receiving that. Ultimately, the net total is a big zero because it's just a transfer. It's not a real expense, not a real income line item, so to speak. But for the purposes of budgeting properly, we list the reserve income on the reserve budget. We list the reserve expense on the operating budget. And then obviously things like loans, if there's, a association just got qualified for a loan and there's a big deposit coming in from that loan to start utilizing those funds, we would record that loan income here. If there's special assessment income coming in to help pay down a loan, help pay down a project, that income will also be logged on your reserve budget in most cases. Sometimes there's a reason to put your special assessment income in the operating budget, depending on what that special assessment was for. But in many cases, that'll be a reserves income line item. Ultimately, your reserves expenses, for the most part, are going to be really relegated to your capital. So sometimes there might be things like if you, again, do have a loan or line of credit, you might have some expense around bank fees, interest, the loan principal repayment, of course, things of that nature. But if you don't have one, largely going to be zeros. And then in terms of reserves and capital expenses, things like your reserve study, probably a good example of one, depending on the size of your budget. For Thatcher Woods, they're looking at potentially, they had plumbing repairs allocated for $150,000 this year. I don't believe they ended up using that. So they might be carrying over and allocating $150,000 again in 2027. But this is where we should be capturing those capital expenses from a budgetary standpoint. We want that on the reserves portion, not on the operating portion, because those should be funded by your reserves account or a special assessment, not commingled and co-funded by your operating account. One thing new for this year that I also want to get to, and then we can start getting into questions and answers, is, so a couple things in addition. We do have additional general ledger description detail in column J for everyone. So as you see your draft budget, you will be able to see a little bit of additional detail if you have confusion about what that category is for. You will also be able to see in column I, the increase or decrease. So whatever that budget number is compared to the 2026 budget, that will be reflected in this column. So whether it was 0% because it went unchanged, whether it increased 3%, whether it increased 27%, your percentage increase will be listed there. We do have the ability to also reflect that as a dollar amount rather than a percentage, depending on what you need. And then the change, we also have a column for any context as to that change. So if there's, rhyme or reason of why insurance or legal collections had like a 27% increase, and there's a note from the manager to say it's because of X, Y, and Z, in the change and in the explanation area is where you'll be able to see a little bit of extra detail. The thing I'm most excited about for this year, and this was definitely something that we ultimately used to, we still do, but we've now made it part of the budget draft, is that if you scroll further to the right, you will now be able to see the monthly allocations. So if you're a board, and you should be, who's sensitive to actually allocating like planned expenses in the months they actually hit, this allows us to do that in real time. So for instance, one example that I looked at earlier today when this draft budget was initially produced was that snow removal was budgeted to hit in the $7,000 initially was budgeted as an equal expense throughout 12 calendar months. Given that this is a community in the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, we know that snow is largely relegated to November through March, sometimes ekes into April, but generally speaking, the 5 months, November through March, are our big snow removal months. So rather than kind of screwing with your budget and making it look like you budget for snow removal every single month, I went in and I allocated this so that we have $1,400 a piece split between January, February, March, and then again with November and December, with April through October being zeroed out. So not only are we putting together your annual budget numbers, but all in the same step, we're now able to start tweaking where those expenses actually hit. Meaning that when you are getting your financials, it should be a much more comprehensive look at where you are at accurately year to date, We're no longer kind of just, lazily putting in this, we're just dividing every single expense category into equal monthly installments. We want it to be reflective of what your real billing cycle is. Insurance is another good example. Maybe you have a policy where you come up with an initial big lump sum payment in January, and then it's monthly installments thereafter. Let's make sure that that's properly allocated and not just off kilter and making your financials kind of confusing and hard to read. And then finally, as I mentioned, as you make any adjustments to assessments, let's say, if you decide, hey, I know that this 3% allocation isn't going to be enough, we're going to need to bump this to $490,000. This will now reflect, this is a 7.28% increase. And now the assessment column for 2027 has been updated. This previously had a number around $827 a month, showing about a $30 increase. And now this shows, $856.61, showing much closer to about a $57 increase for this particular unit owner. So everything is tied together. These tabs talk to each other. So as we're making adjustments, looking at different scenarios, different iterations, we are able to make sure that everything else is talking to each other. Assessments are updated in real time. Reserves are updated in real time. Everything is kind of just cohesive and integrated. So with that, I know we went a little bit over. I just thought it was important to just guide you through some of these things. I would like to open it up to, I know those have been patiently waiting or posted some things in the chat. I would love to start getting into some Q&A. So I will stop sharing my screen for a brief moment here. I'll be able to reopen either the budget screen or the presentation, but I'd be happy to start diving into questions right now. If we wanted to maybe start with some of the chat, because things started getting in here right around 6:28. But we did have one question on the budget. The first or second largest expense is insurance. In Nevada, NRS 116-3113 mandates the HOA obtain insurance, and owners get their own, thus resulting in duplicate insurance. Have you experienced HOAs with duplicate insurance and process to remove HOA insurance and back onto the owner? Adrian, you were on the call. I wanted to see if maybe, just given the NRS specifics here, if you wanted to chime in with anything from your perspective, and I can supplement with anything from mine.
Yeah, I did answer in the chat as well, but yeah, so especially with condominiums, the NRS requires the HOA to have its own insurance policy. Typically it's walls out, so that if anything happens to the structure itself, but the HOA's insurance policy is first. So if something does happen within a unit, the homeowner can file a claim on the HOA's policy, and then their insurance would come second. But we typically, the HOA's insurance won't insure items of like the personal nature, so the personal belongings, furniture, things like that. But say there's a leak in the unit and it's a pipe that services multiple units, then that becomes an HOA's responsibility. So that's where our insurance would kick in. I have seen where HOAs were able to amend their CC&Rs in order to not have to be insured and default all directly on the homeowners, but they usually also have to amend what the maintenance responsibility is, so that the HOAs are maintaining those buildings, the homeowners are. So it just kind of depends on your documents and how they're written in order to have that removed.
Excellent. Thank you for reiterating that. You said it much better than I would have, so that's super helpful. I do think that that question is always a relevant one in any market, though, too, just because I think in most cases, we've always done a diligent job of ensuring that we don't have these like overlap issues or create confusion about who's insuring what, but still a good question to ask, because sometimes that does come up. Insurance guidelines and can be different, even governing document to governing document. So good question to ask regardless. Jonathan Norris, less a question, but makes a comment that I think is worth touching on for everyone on this call. John commented, I appreciate the on-demand reporting on the GL level in Vantaca reports. So if you don't understand what an amount is in the financials, you can drill down to see the details. So what John is referring to is within Vantaca, our management software, as a board member, you are able to access detailed financial reporting beyond what we send you on a monthly basis in that consolidated PDF that board members receive. Also within Vantaca, when you generate any of those reports live in real time, you can drill down on each of those expense categories and actually see the individualized expenses that make up that GL category. Meaning that if you are working with your budget draft and you see that you spent $7,827.12 on plumbing repairs this year, if you go into Vantaca and click on the budget repair category on your P&L, you will be able to see the individualized expenses. Maybe that was 12 different plumbing repairs over the course of a year that made up that expense. Maybe it was one really large expense that was more of a doozy and was a little bit more unpredictable and kind of a one-off emergency expense. So that GL detail is definitely helpful at giving you additional context. Obviously, your management team can provide you those answers, get you expense detail as well. But one of the benefits of utilizing Vantaca as a board member is that a lot of that detail is very visible to you without even having to ask the question. Another question came in asking, will the finance HOA director be able to make adjustments in the timing of expenses directly on your file? Or do we need to tell our Westward 360 manager what to change? So ultimately, most communities that we work with, we've sent the Google Doc to, or some have preferred getting us or us sending them like an exported Excel version of it, which kind of defeats the purpose of looking at a live document. When we have shared the Google link to folks, we are able to open up edit access. We're just very careful and particular with it. So Paulie, your question, like I would say, ask your manager for that permission if that is something that you would like to be able to as finance director, or if another board member on the call, if you are the treasurer, or if you're a finance committee, chair, and if you need that to be able to play with certain scenarios, talk to your manager about it. Let's just make sure that they're aware of the request, and then we can help open that up. Again, we want to be very careful because we don't like opening up permissions too much, and then suddenly there's too many cooks in the kitchen. There's adjustments being made that are hard to kind of track. And then we kind of have to, start over or freshen up that draft if it starts getting a little bit screwy. So short answer is yes, but let's just talk about that with your manager, Paulie, so that we can make sure that we get that permission set up. And then if you wanted to have some freedoms to play around with where those expenses fall in terms of which month and what dollar figure, we can do that. Let's just proceed with a little bit of caution there. Julie Kinney asks, will all of the board members receive the budget draft worksheet and have it posted on the portal to meet our fiduciary responsibilities, or just the president? The entire board will receive that. So we don't want to silo communication and only make sure that just because we have a primary liaison doesn't mean that person is the one that will ultimately be the one who is the only seer of that document. We want the entire board involved and seeing that too. Even if the treasurer and president are generally the two members that have been most involved in the process, we do want all of the board to be able to see that budget, have your opportunity for comments, suggestions, edits, things of that nature. So the entire board will see that. The entire board will receive copy of that. If you have a finance committee that needs that draft, work with your manager to make sure that gets distributed to your finance committee as well, so that they can start working on their analysis and their recommendations as well. Mark Roberts asks a really good and interesting question. If you make your 15% contribution goal to reserves, but then you transfer money out of reserves for an unexpected expense, does that mean you actually didn't make your 15% goal to reserves and you have to contribute more? So broadly speaking, the one caveat I do want to mention is that if there are potential state regulations that differ state by state on this. I don't want to say that this is the blanket answer for everything, but the more important reality is that you are budgeting for that 15% allocation. If the reality ends up being that, you could make the same argument that, hey, we allocated 15% to reserves, but we used that entire contribution because we had that reserves allocation was for budgeted 2027 reserves expenses. So basically, if you're utilizing your reserves expenses from that 15%, generally speaking, that isn't putting you in a position of then saying, oh, shoot, now our contribution is only 10%. We have to arbitrarily come up with it. If you're borrowing from reserves for those unanticipated expenses that come up, or you're reallocating for a different project and things of that nature, you may need to refund your reserves, whether through a special assessment, whether through a different funding plan going into 2028. But generally speaking, that isn't going to negate your 15% allocation. It may impact whether or not you have to replenish your reserves account via a special assessment or a different funding plan later on. But in terms of its impact for meeting your 15% goal for reserves, that should not be impacted. Does that make sense, Mark? Okay, I hope it does. So Thomas Weaver asked, and this was a pre-submitted question that I had on my list to get to as well, is there a best practice to ensure you do not under budget variable expenses, such as adding 3% more than previous year, or should that be handled in the contingency expense? So a little bit of both, in my opinion. I think generally speaking, unless it's a very specific trade or a situation, costs by and large are not going down for just about everything. So I would say when you don't know or don't have a great feel for what potential increases or contingencies could be for a general like repair or maintenance line item, I would bake in a little bit of an inflationary increase on that. CPI as of last week when I was checking was at 4.2%. Historical trends put inflation anywhere between 2.5% and 3.5% for the last couple of years. So there could be some inflationary guidelines that allow you to bump up each of your individual categories, maybe anywhere between 1% and 5%. I would say an overall contingency is not a bad idea of anywhere between 3 to 5% of your overall expenses, and just putting that in a contingency line item. Maybe that shakes out to $5,000, maybe it's $10,000, maybe it's $20,000. But if you have the luxury of a little bit larger of a budget with fewer expenses than you were anticipating, and you can create that contingency, not a bad thing to have in place. But I don't think that should be exclusive of also factoring in known inflation for some of, let's say your electricity provider has sent out a notice to customers in your area to anticipate a 7% increase. Budget for that 7% increase on your electrical. Don't just wrap that into your contingency plan for an unplanned plumbing backup or an unplanned roofing collapse, whatever the case is. So I would say it's more of a yes and rather than an either or. I think properly allocating for inflation and a contingency is the ideal scenario. Don Thorpe had a question. Our board has 3 members. We also have a budget committee. If 2 or more members attend a budget committee, does that trigger the open meeting requirement, even if we're only discussing alternative, not making decisions? Yeah, so ultimately, if you have a 3-member board and 2 of your board members are attending and conducting board business, if you're Don, if you're in Illinois, for example, that would constitute board business being discussed with a quorum of the board. So ultimately, even if that's just discussing your budget alternatives, the argument could be made that that is a meeting. It doesn't mean that you have to allow participation from your unit owners in that meeting, but from like a CYA perspective, at least in the state of Illinois and against the letter of the law, I would say best practice, like especially if you're doing that via a virtual meeting, might be to just have your manager send out a quick notice of this is the Google Meet link that's being used. Everyone will be muted. There won't be open forum at this meeting. The purpose isn't to discuss, broad business and owner questions. This is a working session of the board. People can attend, listen in, kind of not participate, but just listen to what the board is doing. That would probably be the best, most conservative way to approach that. When all else fails, consult your attorney just to get a little bit of their guidance, but 2 of 3 board members does constitute a quorum of that board meeting, ultimately. Often there's usually, at least in Illinois as an example, there are sometimes provisions that you can't have a majority of the board on a committee or a commission, which allows that committee or commission to operate a little bit more freely without having to notice every single meeting, because they don't usually have a quorum of the board on that. So one strategy might be delegating to, your treasurer, and then maybe like a finance committee amongst the homeowners that might be willing to volunteer and help. But that's also just one alternative strategy you could consider. Terrence asks, question on reserves. Out of 100 HOAs, about how many in your experience reach the 100% of reserves funding? Want to know how difficult the goal is. Shooting totally from the hip, I would be very surprised if even like 50% or a majority of most boards, in my experience, that are at full funding. I think it's one of those things that is generally, I don't want to say it's a pipe dream and say it's not totally achievable. I have seen associations that follow their reserve study to a T, have been able to budget and plan to a T to their reserve study. I find that often reserve studies are very aspirational. I think that there's a lot of reality that they don't always account for in terms of different emergencies and different expense issues that might have come up over the years. So your reserve study, while it's an incredibly useful document and something that does have a lot of bearing for you to follow, I would say it's not all that common or frequent in my experience that a lot of boards hit their full funding plan. Sometimes a reserve study might come with a few different iterations of that reserves funding plan that are, fully funded, moderately funded, minimum funded, and give you a few different iterations to look at. But if it makes you feel better, if that's where the question is kind of coming from, it's not all that common that HOAs are able to really follow that and have 100% fully funded reserve to the letter of specificity that the reserve study calls for. Adrian, do you have anything to add on that in your experience?
So in Nevada, I would say the law states adequately funded, which it doesn't give you what adequate is by definition of a percentage. However, it's common practice, and what the real estate division looks for is 70% or more funded. So most associations, it depends, but 90% of them that I've worked with, as long as they hit that 70 mark, they're happy there, and same, not very many of them go to the full 100%.
Thank you for that. And that is a good point too. There are going to be ultimately some differences state by state too, with some of the reserve requirements and some of the practices that have to be followed. But I think Adrian's spot on, not only just from like a Nevada perspective, but generally speaking, I think that even that 70% number is probably a much more realistic number that a lot of communities can or do strive for. But yeah, again, the adequately funded reserves is always one of those, I think it's strategically used to kind of keep it vague, almost in the association's favor, because I think that setting, a real dollar figure can be really dependent on the kinds of amenities, the kinds of common elements you have or don't have, because every community they're not cookie cutter. Mindy, you've got a more specific question just in relation to your specific community's contract expiring for renewal rates on management fee and fee schedule. If you don't mind reaching out to me, I will make sure I can help with just that renewal agreement and make sure that we have those numbers for you. And then we'll make sure that 2027 fee schedule is included in that as well. So Mindy, I'd be happy to work with you personally on that.
Thank you, Eric. You're very impressive.
Thanks, Mindy. Jane asks, in relation to board meetings, we commonly make decisions via email communication rather than in-person meetings. Are those considered legal? That is a good question. Jane, do you mind sharing where your association is located? If you're able to unmute, Missouri, okay. That helps a little bit here. So I will say, I might have to give you a little bit more detailed of an answer offline just to verify a couple of things. I don't believe Roberta, our general manager in our Missouri office, is on right now to chime in on a couple of more specific items here. More or less, generally speaking, board decision making on association decision making or board business happening in the confines of email and not in the confines of a board meeting that was properly noticed is generally against best practice. I think that there are express and discrete scenarios, whether it's for executive session purposes or for, certain decisions. Maybe you have an overnight emergency and you have to authorize a pretty large expense without, the luxury of being able to call a board meeting to authorize that because it's an emergency. So obviously certain things that happen that in the interest of time have to happen. Best practice would be if that was made via email to at least ensure that at your next regularly scheduled board meeting that you ratify those decisions that were made via email into your minutes so that there is a record of them. That would be ideal. I would say if you have, if you're willing to maybe change course a little bit, I would try to get away from making your decisions in email and not in the confines of your board meetings. For example, there's some case law that generally speaking, this is specific to Illinois, mind you, but it had some ramifications in some nearby states in the Midwest. But there was something called the Palm 2 decision back in 2014 in the state of Illinois that came out of a really big litigation case for a high rise on Lakeshore Drive. Right along Lake Michigan, where basically the long and short of it was that this board was operating with a bunch of closed session meetings, which aren't really a thing in Illinois, making a lot of budgetary decisions, making expense decisions, making decisions about things that weren't privileged to be within the confines of executive session. So this created a lot of legislation within the state of Illinois that decision-making had to be in the confines of open board meetings, that owners had the right to attend, not necessarily participate, things of that nature. So best practice, generally speaking, is to not be taking board votes and making decisions in the confines of email. That could come back to bite you, whether it's because of legal implications, whether it's because of things in your governing documents. But generally speaking, best practices is that your board decision making, unless urgent or an emergency, should be happening at your board meetings. A strategy that we often recommend employing if, hey, it's hard to get all of our board members scheduled, that's the beauty of virtual meetings, in my opinion. In Illinois, one of the things that we did, we only need 48 hours to call for a board meeting. So being able to quickly get, hey, it's Monday, board needs to make a decision on their landscaping contract by Friday to lock in their rate. Why not call the very quick virtual meeting for Thursday morning at 9 a.m. that everyone can call into for 5 minutes to make that vote? We can properly notice it. Very easy, very simple. It can really work for them. I'm not saying that applies to every state. There are other things like in Nevada or in Florida where there might be constraints around those. But in states like Illinois, in Missouri, in Indiana for that matter, there is a little bit more leeway there. So if you can just hit your notice requirement, send out those virtual credentials, hop on a 5-minute meeting to make that important decision, make that part of the confines of a board meeting. But again, when in doubt, I would say any of those decisions, Jane, that you guys have made recently in email, ratify those in your minutes, record those decisions, make sure that there's a paper trail around them. The last thing you want is someone saying and coming out of the woodwork next year, Jane, I'm really confused. It looks like the board made a lot of vendor changes this year, and I don't see any record of that in the minutes. When did you make those changes? And if your answer is that we did all of this via email, that might not go over so well with that owner and the rest of the community. So sorry if that was a little bit long-winded, but I wanted to make sure that that helped a little bit. There you go. And your executive meeting, as long as you're talking about executive session items and executive session privileged topics, totally fine. Stacy, you ask a really great question, and that actually kind of gives a head up on a session that we are planning to do later in September, actually. But we will be doing a bit of a lay of the land, board member responsibilities, continuing education session with board members, not only to capture things like your responsibilities if you're a new board member, but even for tenured board members, getting a reorientation in terms of what are my responsibilities as president, secretary, treasurer, director at large, officer at large, whatever the case is, and going over those will be something that we will be doing. And then we can also go over lay of the land kind of things in relation to just general best practices of working with Westward 360 as well. And then finally, Mike Sino asks, will there be a transcript of this meeting in addition to the recording? Yes, there will be. So we will have the Gemini notes that'll not only have the notes in kind of big bullets, but it'll also have the detailed transcript of these things too. So if you want to go and dive into the weeds for some more detailed discussion points, those will all be in those Gemini notes that we'll be able to share with attendees as well. That takes us through questions that were asked via chat, and I think we got to a few things from hands that were raised. Any questions from those in attendance that have not yet heard the answer they were looking for, or haven't heard the question that they were interested in getting answered? Okay. Well, then with that, first and foremost, thank you to everyone for staying on. Oh, Julie asked, who do we contact if we don't get the budget? Contact your manager. That is the first and best resource to reach out to. If you're not getting a response from your manager for any reason, we want to know about that. So folks should have their escalation paths available. So if you need to loop in a supervisor, if you need to loop me in too, if it's that urgent, feel free to ping me and I can get on the team. But if you do not get your budget in the coming weeks here, again, I mentioned that reconciliations are going to be wrapped up for June between the 15th and 20th. We expect managers will begin to start being able to send out many of their draft budgets starting between July 15th and through the end of the month. So a number of you should likely start to see initial drafts for your upcoming workshops coming out. I would expect the overwhelming majority of a lot of budgets will be coming out in the first couple weeks of August if it's taking a little bit more time for your manager to go through that initial draft. But if you do want to make sure that you're on the same page with your manager, send them a quick note, give them a call, make sure that you're on the same page about that timeline. Also a good opportunity to kind of get your ducks in a row for the rest of the timeline for the calendar year. So things like your budget adoption meeting date, things like the date by which you're sending notices out to everyone. So also really a good opportunity to kind of just get those remaining meeting dates and expectations aligned with your team. And yes, Stacy, thanks for answering that question. The Gemini notes will be going out to folks a little bit shortly after this meeting. The recording will be available, honestly, probably later tonight. We ask for everyone to have a couple of days of patience. We usually like to go in, and if there's anything that needs to be slightly edited or we need to add like a header page before the session starts, we usually do that. I would expect that recordings will be out to everyone and posted on our website by no later than Friday this week. So do stay tuned for that. If you want to share the recording with your fellow board members who maybe couldn't attend, or your finance committees, or anyone else that you think will be helpful, we will get that out to you. And Mike, yes, that will be emailed out to everyone. Our marketing team, Sydney and Janice, will be sending out that follow-up. And thank you to everyone. And that'll include the links to those items. Alrighty. Well, thank you, everyone. Stay tuned for upcoming announcements on any additional budget, more specific trainings by local market as well. We've got some plans in the works as we get further into budget season. Again, we have that reserve study webinar coming up on July 21st, which is going to be a good session as well. And stay tuned for more coming up on our events and education page throughout the rest of the third and fourth quarters. We have a lot of exciting sessions coming up that I think will be really valuable for you to attend. And again, we will also have links available of the recordings if there's any sessions that you just have conflicts for. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate everyone's attendance, diligence, and participation. We look forward to the next time. Adrian, thank you for manning the store with the chat and chiming in with some really great perspective as well. And have a great evening, everyone.